Welcome back to Public Policy. This week I am presenting an option that I would like to encourage you to consider and embrace throughout the course. As you are learning, or perhaps already know very well, as you are reading Global Citizen, Donella Meadows is no longer with us, but she was one of the most brilliant and visionary systems analysts in the environmental world that we have yet to see. You are learning that environmental conflict and environmental conflict resolution are no longer simply a question of national, state, local, rule of law, public policy, and effective government service practice. It is necessarily, because it is a global discussion in a time when we're facing dramatic climate change because of global warming. And I'll tell you, even though there can be many differences of opinion within this debate, global warming is happening. I was recently in Alaska, and I'm well aware of how glaciers are melting. I'm also aware, living in Southern California, that the ocean temperatures are rising. Scientists are being honest with us. They cannot predict the consequences, the storms, the rise in ocean. Some are predicting Miami and other cities like it will disappear. And the climate changes, and we're seeing them. I would say with the ocean warming, Southern California is becoming more of a desert, more of a warmer place. We will be experiencing and observing the consequences of allowing these glaciers to melt over the next years. But my point in mentioning that this is a global issue is that this is also an issue of personal choice, consumption, lifestyle. Individuals do make a difference in this discussion in many different ways, and the Global Citizen is introducing the most important topics to you. I hope every week you will use that reading to stimulate your own personal discussion as you explore your own lifestyle, your own future, trying to create environmental sustainability and hopefully a prosperous, satisfying, deeply fulfilling life for yourself as we face these challenges. I would like this week to talk, and this will be the only week that I talk about my own personal environmental narrative story and the dilemmas I have faced in making my own choices about how I live this life with a love for this planet, for this earth, with a love for this life and the people that are in this life with me. It has been a lifetime journey that is still unfolding. And I do not want this class to become moralistic, righteous, dogmatic. I don't want to be preaching to any of you about how you should or should not live. I believe some of that extremism has actually hurt this conversation. Too many people believe they are the authorities for others. And environmentalists can actually be some of the most positional and dogmatic people that we work with in NCRP. So I'm not suggesting any kind of prescription for any of you. And I hope by being vulnerable and personal with you, human, less than perfect in many ways, I will encourage you to be more open and honest with each other. It is critically important we have these conversations together. Now, I was blessed to be born into a family that spoke 3 languages. And particularly, I am very grateful to the Norwegian-speaking people in my family who not only spoke a different language, but introduced a culture with love of nature, love for the environment at its heart. If any of you have ever visited Norway or any of the Scandinavian countries, full of the glaciers, fjords, compared to Alaska in its wilderness and its stark beauty, you will see that many Scandinavian people have a cabin in the country. That, somewhat like the Midwest where I grew up, where we have our cabins in northern Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, along Lake Michigan and some of the other beautiful lakes. That's just a way of living, to be in nature. And I feel very fortunate that that is exactly what my family did. Though it was one of the German-speaking members of my family, my grandfather, whose family immigrated to this country in the early 1800s. And their closeness to land included farming. And I have very proud relatives still alive today who are proud of the fact that they have never lived with running water or electricity. So you get a picture of some of the diversity in my family. I actually attempted to live without electricity, readily available water, or centralized heat for almost a year of my life in northwestern Wisconsin. We relied on saunas for heat during the winter. It was a very interesting experiment for me, and I'll tell you, I am not part of the Back to the Land movement. I grew up in a city. I lived in one of our major cities for the first 13 years of my life, and I am not born to be a farmer or anyone who lives that frugally on the land. But I had this influence, and my grandfather did build the cabin on Lake Michigan in Door County, Wisconsin, a very charming part of Wisconsin compared to Cape Cod. I was very fortunate. I spent my summers in the country and at camp, even though I was growing up in a major city. Very fortunate. So you can imagine that I began my life loving nature as well. But not just the forest, the lakes, the flowers, the wildlife. I also grew up with people, particularly the Norwegian-speaking women in my family, who believed in disciplining themselves and taking care of their bodies. Because we are part of nature ourselves. We are products, we are created, we live and die. And they had a more intimate relation with taking care of their bodies than most Americans I know. My grandmother very proudly would show us her leg lifts in her 60s, and one of my great aunts could do a back bend, a full back bend in her 60s. Can you believe it? That same great aunt, even though she grew up very prosperous in Norway, at least relatively so. Her father was the mayor of Bergen, if any of you have been to Norway, a beautiful coastal community with a World Heritage Site. She still, took great pride in that daily taking care of her body. She would go for long swims, walks, bird watching. Some of the stereotypes you might hear about Scandinavian people might be true. But that was something precious for me, and it's been interesting. The reason I'm mentioning it to you right now is I believe our relationship with consumption, whether it is food, things, land, energy, is at the heart of environmental conflict. Water is another big issue right now. And learning to balance my consumption on an intimate personal level, that's intrapersonal peace building, learning not to overconsume. And as a woman who is getting older, it's not easy what they were teaching me. And looking at Americans right now and their struggle with obesity, this is an environmental conflict issue because they are likely to be consuming oil and gas, material things. I could go through the list. In ways that are abusive to themselves and to this planet in very sad, disheartening ways. One of the things I have noticed over my years of teaching, starting as a relatively young professor, and now, becoming one of your more senior professors, is that I have inspired my students not only to learn these skills that make a difference, not only to embrace NCRP as their future career path, but many to lose weight and take better care of themselves as part of nature. And I think this is something that's important to talk about today. When I was a young girl, I learned early on that Americans, I think I was 18, 19, I learned early on that Americans were consuming a greater percentage of the world's resources than anyone else in this world. And at that young age, I thought, this is wrong. I felt this is wrong. What is wrong with this picture? That America, this place I'm so proud of, a democracy of people from all around the world, a place of human rights, that I could go on and on with what I respect about our country. But that the people of this country were over-consuming. I was not built the way that many Americans are built growing up with the people I grew up with. Being frugal was something my grandmother was as proud of as cleanliness. Christian faith was very important to my father's side of my family, and they lived it in some very different ways. But on the side that doesn't sound righteous or moralistic, they were also world adventurers. I come from a family of captains of merchant ships from Norway, so they had traveled long ago to India and other exotic places in the world. As I've mentioned to you, physical fitness was something important to them, and being out on the water and doing things that, if I would tell you more, you'd find outrageous and risky. That was a way of living for them. So at the same age that I learned that most Americans were consuming more resources than the rest of the world, and I felt that was wrong, I felt very strongly that I wanted to never have too much stuff, so that if I was given an opportunity, an exciting opportunity to travel or move, to enhance my life, I would be able to quickly pack up the little I owned and go. I felt that very strongly, and I take that as a sign of a grandchild of immigrants to the country, fairly recent immigrants to the country, but also the adventurous spirit of my Norwegian-speaking family. And to me, this enhanced my life. Now, for us, you can imagine, in many ways, nature is our church. We see it as quite sacred to be in the forest, to be by the water. For me, having moved after many years, I'll tell you a bit of this journey, to the Rocky Mountains and now to the Golden State of California, being around the most beautiful of nature and trying to care for it however I might, to me is one of the richest parts of living. And so we have a different family richness. Our cabin is very modest. It's quite small and cozy. It requires intimacy when all the grandchildren, the nieces and nephews, the extended family come together. And they do. My family built cabins with my grandfather along a third of the bay. So I can walk, up and down that road, and I run into cousins, I run into aunts and uncles. We try to gather there most summers, and because it's such a small cabin, we are sitting out in the woods. We are sitting by the water, being inside, protected from the outside. That really isn't the way that we tend to live, and this is actually true for our youngest members of our family. They love nature. They love going for walks to see the wildlife and the birds, and they're texting, and they're, in constant communication with their friends. But this is still at the heart of our way of living. So you can imagine that we do not understand the mansions of Americans, this constant competition to have bigger and more. We all live, thank God, prosperous lives. Nobody is lacking or suffering. In fact, most of my family's pretty impressive in what they do and how they live. But we just don't. And maybe that's the answer. We're not competing on that land level, on that housing level, on that car level to impress people. Because with a rich education and a family life, and education probably was the number one value, we all have found ways to impress the world without having the biggest house, without having the most expensive car. Certainly, hearing how many Americans, and as a lawyer I've seen this, are forcing themselves to be buried under crippling debt. Orange County, California is famous for this. Overspending on credit cards, buying the expensive car, not having enough because of that burden. That was not planted in my life, and I'm grateful. That is some of what we're looking at with the world. But let me say some of the choices that I had to look at in this, what sounds right now probably like an idyllic life. As a young woman, I went to a religious school for the first 2 years of my education and learned about world hunger. I decided I needed to become vegetarian in order to help with world hunger. Now, I'm no longer vegetarian. I don't have enough time to give you all the details of my life. But having just come from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, where I was a Fulbright Distinguished Chair in a country that reveres cattle ranching, much like the United States, the leather products, the meat consumption. Fortunately, I have never felt that hunger for red meat. And I'll tell you, the research shows that if we could all walk away from eating red meat, from ranching, from killing cattle, much like the Hindus of India, climate change would be a very different discussion. We could really potently address this challenge just by focusing on red meat consumption. So that is one of the choices I've had to face. And the balance I've done with this dilemma is I'm not purely vegetarian because, once again, I don't believe extremism is the way forward for any of us. I also went through a dilemma when I was hired by an elite law firm. And this was years ago in my 20s. I had the perfect home in the perfect neighborhood, impressing everybody. And I felt, as you can imagine, burdened by this. I had all the prestige, power, money that any American at least, but probably many around the world could long for. But this was not the lifestyle for my soul. And so I went through a difficult period of trying to get off the fast track, of trying to be true to myself rather than societal values that this kind of, prestige, power, money was what we lived for. Fortunately, I was able to leave my law firm. I went on a spiritual journey. I don't have time to talk about that in this class. But I'll tell you how empty I've never had a regret. I've never, if any of you are considering something like this or have done this, I've never looked back. I felt liberated by leaving this limited, suffocating world of the wealthy. I still find very sad how many of those law partners with such wealth, with such power, live for competing, buying the next big impressive house, the expensive yacht, the car. What a sad life in my mind, a prison. And I have met many people since, because my life, is many people's dream right now. Having all expense paid trips around the world, doing such a joyous, occupation in such a meaningful field. But they ask me, well, how can I have it all? Not leave the power, the profit, the prestige, and be true to myself, have a joyous, happy life that is meaningful. And I don't believe you can approach it that way. I think you need to decide, how to have enough, how to not have too much to give yourself freedom in order to take this path. Now, I don't have that much time. I don't want to go beyond 30 minutes with you today, so let me fast forward on my spiritual journey. As I said to you, one of the things that I did is I did deep soul searching. I asked, what is most important to me? What makes me happy? And no surprise, anytime I'm having a glass of wine or eating with family outside in nature, I feel wealthy. That's the way it is for me. It's not the expensive suits, it's not the expensive cars, it's not the huge, spacious mansion where I can stay away from my husband and the people I love. No, it's sitting outside, having some peace, some time together, some, gourmet pleasure. So I moved to the Rocky Mountains, and that was my parents' encouragement. It is one of the most stunningly beautiful places in the world. It was also a relatively affordable place to do a spiritual search, to go through this soul-searching process. But what I discovered living there, I had been, I have driven a car most of my adult life, like most of us in this country. And if you ever want to see what happens when everybody drives a car, I encourage you to visit India or China if you haven't yet had a chance, particularly their major cities. Rio de Janeiro was another example. Like New York, we can't all drive. And I learned this in the Rockies because my beautiful mountains were cloaked in the air pollution of, all of the driving. And some I could go into industrial pollution as well. But the driving is a big issue, because if we could tackle this one, it would also make a big dent in our environmental conflict. I decided when I was asked by the University of California, Berkeley, to move to Berkeley and start to teach multicultural conflict resolution in their peace studies program, that I would try to live without a car for the first time in my life. Now, like New York, San Francisco and the surrounding area allows this. They have a wonderful transit system. Berkeley is very walkable, like Manhattan. And I loved living without a car. I rented a car the occasional times I needed a car to go see friends and family. But generally, I was able to get around. I was the lightest I've ever been, weight-wise, walking every day. But more importantly to me, I was more connected with my community. I got to know the homeless in my community. I got to know, all the people and their homes. I walked by them every day. It was really an enriching way of living. So that's one of the choices. But then I was invited to move to Southern California. It's just not set up for this lifestyle. I have figured out a way to have a minimal commute. And I would encourage all of you to talk about this. Because the people who have an hour and a half commute, that's to have the big piece of land and the big mansion home for their family. And I don't think it's worth the price. The congestion, the air pollution, let alone the stress, the horrible, sitting in traffic all the time. It's one of the factors to address. Now, in my story, you have probably gathered, or maybe not, I had hoped to have my own children when I was young and thought that I would, but that did not happen for me. A great loss, a grief that is a lifelong grieving process. Fortunately, I now have stepsons. I've gone on with my life. But the reason I'm bringing this up, in my family, I had a great aunt who was born wealthy, actually, but very rebellious. She was part of the Unitarian Universalist Church, questioned God, the Bible, a very bright, very active woman who did not believe in just war. And after serving and entertaining in World War II, became the first peace activist in my family. She early on informed all of us that having more than 2 children was a criminal act. And I do think with the overpopulation of the earth right now, and I'm not going to turn this into a pro or anti-abortion debate because it's so much more than that. Family planning should be happening at the family level, where aunts and mothers and fathers are telling their children, I don't need you to have, more than 2 children in your family to be fully satisfied and proud. We no longer live on a farm. We're no longer poor where we need to worry about the death of children and the need for children to support us. Times are different. And what has worked very powerfully in India with reproduction is television. Poor women watching television have noticed that women are more affluent and living, wealthier lives with less children. These are the kind of discussions we need to have for the sake of our future and our planet's health. Now, reducing our carbon footprint has become a popular discussion. Throughout everything I'm saying to you, I'm not taking sides in polarized political debates. And I hope you hear that I believe wholeheartedly in freedom of choice for all human beings. In fact, health, family, freedom, those are all some of my most important values as well. And so reducing the carbon footprint, once again, I'm not approaching this in a moralistic way, in a should. You should live this way, you should not. But airplane travel is one of my big questions. Now, planting trees is something I can do. Trying to help with protecting the Amazon, the rainforest, is something I can do, because that will offset some of the other choices that I make. But learning how, to maneuver all of this, it's not easy. I will say, though, in closing today, that I really look forward to having these essential conversations with all of you. The early environmentalists talked about voluntary simplicity. I don't really like that frame. I would like to reframe it in one of their alternative frames: soulful living, satisfying living, happy living, where we feel fulfilled, where we feel we are enough, we have enough. The best of living, that's the conversation we need to be having. And starting again next week, we will go back to the more bureaucratic, technical, rule of law, NCRP process discussion of how we use NCRP to help people have these conversations, to encourage them to share their own stories, to help them. I happen to believe that there are addictions in this world in addition to drugs and alcohol. There's an addiction with shopping and consumption, for example. I met a woman who grew up in Beverly Hills, lacking nothing, who is extraordinarily wealthy today, who still lives in fear because she cannot control her shopping and her consumption. We must be acknowledging these problems. Of course, some people have eating addictions, eating disorders. I think in the environmental world, we're going to need to start to acknowledge some of these personal challenges and come together as community to support and help each other in being good to ourselves as well as the earth. That is how we're going to create sustainable futures. Well, I hope you enjoyed some of this. I promise I will not do this again. Have a wonderful week.